Go.
Hello, my dear students, and this is the quick summary of what I'm going to expect for the discussion portion of the lab report. So if you pull up your lab report, you'll see I start with a news report out of Australia. The Canberra Times reported that students were looking on as a teacher conducted an experiment involving sugar and sulfuric acid inside a cabinet when the glass container holding the acid exploded. And there's some things I did to ensure our safety. Sometimes I look very cavalier when I'm doing these explosions, these reactions, these demonstrations, and when y'all are doing the lab, that you don't realize behind the scenes some other things that are going on that ensure your safety, because the number one thing that I am always concerned about is the safety of my students. That said, we use Pyrex glassware, good thick wall Pyrex beakers that have a low thermal coefficient heat expansion, a low thermal coefficient of expansion due to heat, so that when they're heated, even if they're heated unevenly, they will not break. You won't get stresses and strains, and they're far less likely to break than normal glassware. I was using small volumes. I was maintaining my distance. I put the extra reagents away from the reaction so they can't accidentally participate in the reaction. I use a blast shield. I use eye protection. I wear a lab coat. You know, there are things we do to minimize our exposure. So this experiment starts out with 2 questions regarding safety. As you scroll down to this experiment, I have the safety warnings there, and almost every answer to every question can be found in here. If you look, it says describe 2 potential hazards in the experiment. Well, we're working with glass, so that could break and cut. We're working with high temperatures, steam, and hot glass, so it can burn. We're working with concentrated acid, so that can burn and can poison. So the hazards are there. What safety precautions do we take? We put on our safety glasses. We wear a lab coat. We use beaker tongs to handle the hot beaker. We never taste or smell or really even touch anything in the lab, any chemicals in the lab. So we don't have to worry about artificial poisoning, either by ingestion or some of these can be absorbed through the skin. You have to be very careful. We kept a blast shield between us and the beaker. We use small quantities that I know are safe and have done many times before. So you're training with an experienced chemist who knows and has been trained in safety. So, they're the hazards, they're the precautions we take. Roll back the tape if you didn't catch them. I'm not going to stop and write in my answers like I do sometimes. I want to hear it in your words. Try to write in complete sentences and just answer these questions. Now, what would happen if I put 50 grams of granulated sugar, and that's double the amount we used, and added a bunch of sulfuric acid to a flask and then swirled it, which will accelerate the reaction? Well, the danger is with this narrow opening, it may expand more quickly than it's able to be extruded from the top. And that graphite is hard. It actually, even though it was porous and you could crush it, its expansion could very likely break this glass. I don't know what type of glassware was being used, if it was laboratory glassware, if it was a beaker or a cylinder or a flask, but you need a wide mouth beaker, and that's the only safe way to do this. Or even we have things called evaporation glasses and watch glasses that we can use that would be safe too. So the risk is, I predict it would break. Now it says what happens when concentrated sulfuric acid is mixed. We saw the reaction change color. We saw it heat up and turn a dark black. First it turned yellow, then kind of a brown Coca-Cola color. You weren't in the lab, but if you smelled the hot sugar, it smelled like caramel or burning sugar, like someone left a cake or their cupcakes in the oven. And the room smells like that now. It's not an unpleasant smell, but it is a smell. And when we smell, we either smell naturally or we waft small amounts. We don't stick our nose over a flask, certainly one of the flasks with a reaction going on like we just observed. That would be so dangerous. But we saw it change color, then we saw it turn black, and we saw steam coming out, and then we saw the carbon, the graphite, being extruded from the beaker, pushed out of the beaker. So describe and or illustrate. I don't see how you can illustrate. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You can attach a picture and say see attached. What evidence did you observe that a chemical reaction took place? We've been talking about three main ways that a chemical reaction that we describe with these equations that we can identify a reaction has taken place. A change in color, the evolution of a gas is given off, or the formation of a precipitate, which is what our latest assignment previous to this lab covered, and which I will be posting a screencast of it and the answers very soon, so I get you a good grade. That reaction we just did, the classic carbon souffle reaction between sulfuric acid and sucrose, had two of the three. We had a color change, and we definitely had evolution of a gas in the form of water vapor or steam. And we made a new, clearly identifiable different product, so it's clear that a reaction took place. Was heat released? Yes, heat was released quite a bit. The heat flowed this way. The chemical bonds between oxygen and carbon, and oxygen and hydrogen, and hydrogen and oxygen, and hydrogen and carbon have their own bond energies. And when you break those bonds and release the H2O, the H's and the O's to form H2O, it's a more stable configuration. And it's also lower energy. So the excess energy contained in those bonds, you had to put energy in to make the sucrose. We know that plants do that with energy from the sun, right? But the sugar cane does, where we get our sucrose. Well, that energy is being released very, very rapidly, but it's being released. And as it's released in that water's form, it's being released as thermal energy. That water heats up and speeds up the reaction, and also provides the gas pockets to expand the graphite and make it expand and seem to have a greater volume than it really does. So that's the flow of heat. It's the energy contained in bonds being converted to thermal energy. Now the dehydration of sucrose separates water from carbohydrate. And it says just write the skeleton chemical equation. And like all of these questions, the answers are up here in our description. And here is the reaction. Sucrose, solid, gives us carbon and water. There's your skeleton reaction. The sulfuric acid is almost a catalyst in this case. So, moving on to the last sort of discussion question. Sucrose is a disaccharide, and it's sucrose not sucrose, sorry. Sucrose is glucose plus fructose hooked together. Many things in our lives are made up of these sugars or carbohydrates. Classic examples are paper, a paper cup. I'm doing this because cotton is made up of the same material as paper. Glucose units linked end to end in a beta linkage. We can't digest the beta linkage, but, and there's a difference between paper and cotton. These fibers are longer, they're softer because they contain less lignin, which is a cross-linking additional structural material in the cell walls of plants. And so, if we mixed or spilled sulfuric acid onto a paper cup or a cotton shirt, what would happen? And also a potato. I meant to bring a potato in, but I forgot. Potato is just a carbohydrate, mainly, starch, glucose units linked end to end for 100, 1,000 units long, instead of just 2 like sucrose, but the same thing would happen. It would be dehydrated by the sulfuric acid, and it would turn black, leaving the carbon behind. And here's a classic example. These are the paper towels I use to wipe the drips off the bottle and the beaker. And wherever a drip went, it ate through the paper the same way it leaked through your skin, like the skin on my neck. And it didn't turn black, it turned red because it was bleeding because it ate down to the underlying layer. But in each of these cases, and here's the answer to your question, it will dehydrate the sugar, leaving carbon behind. And it will, you'll end up, if you have a cotton shirt, my wife can attest to this. I can walk home and she goes, "Oh, were you working in the lab today?" Because wherever a little splash or a little drop goes on my pants or my shirt is where, a hole will develop. Because it will eat away. You may not notice it right away, it may not be apparent, but after you wash it, it's quite apparent. Hence the lab coat when we stop and go to the lab. So that's your lab report. Those are the expectations for the answers. Try to put them in your own words best you can. Hand that in. Do not forget, the lab reports count the same as an exam. The lab reports will be averaged and count 25% of your grade. We're doing them together. I'm giving you the answers. There's no reason you shouldn't have 100 for your lab report and your daily work. So it's your tests that are going to maybe separate you, the A's from the B's. But if you just do what I tell you and you follow along, everybody's going to pass this course. We'll talk more about that in the class stream later. And until the next lab, which we'll be doing labs this week, stay safe.